I'm here online this morning with Odilon de la Varine and Bertrand Verduzier. Odilon is cellar master at Champagne Gosset in Epernay, and Bertrand Verduzier is director of the international business with Gosset. So good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
How is life in Champagne at the moment, Odilon? Are we good?
It's grey and raining at the moment.
It sounds like a day that we need champagne then. So I'd like to just talk a little bit first maybe about the background of the house, Champagne Gosset. So maybe Bertrand, could you give us just a little bit of history?
So Champagne Gosset was actually started in 1584 in the village of Ailly, which is originally one of the main regions for producing champagne. Ailly is still today a Grand Cru in the appellation. So it's a very long story. It's a very old story, and it's a family story. So there's been many generations of the Gosset family transmitting the company, and in recent years, in the early 90s, which is not that recent, but at the scale of Gosset, it's recent, the original Gosset family transmitted the company to the Cointreau family, which also owns Cognac Frappin. The story of Gosset is about starting with Pierre Gosset. So in the late 16th, it's about, of course, producing wine, still wine in the early years, for approximately 200 years, and then gradually shifting to making sparkling wine. So, it's really the story of making wine first at Gosset is very strong. It's not always been just bubbles. And I think it's something that's still very much present in the DNA of the brands. What's of course still very distinctive about the Gosset production, which is inherited from all those years, and is of course the development of a special technique. And I will of course let Odilon explain about this, about the style, the ambition behind the wines. But very simply, the bottle of Gosset is always represented by the antique vessel, which is this bottle shape, and it's quite important in terms of identity, to convey this idea of artisanship, of quality.
The history of the house dates back to 1584.
Yes.
So, Odilon, you certainly haven't been there since 1584. So, what is your relation?
No, I'm old, but not enough.
So, how long, Odilon, have you been working with Gosset? And what was your background before that?
Oh yeah, I'm at Gosset for, I don't know, about 14 years now, and winemaker since 1988 in several regions, and back to Champagne in 1991 as cellar master in different houses. Spent a few years at Deutz, Oriot, and then Gosset.
And what is it about Gosset that particularly attracted you? What's the philosophy of Gosset that you love so much and that you wanted to continue?
Gosset is, for me, especially for the winemaker, is a very interesting house because, as Bertrand told you, it is the oldest wine house in Champagne. So for a winemaker, the term wine is very important. It's not bubble, it's wine first. And what is very attractive what was very attractive for me, and still, is the fact that to be there for more than 4 centuries means that Gosset has always been at the looking forward. Always look forward, because if not, we wouldn't be there at that time.
Yes, a great sort of one foot in the past with its tradition, but also one foot in the present and the future, with its embracing of modern techniques and modern technology.
It's not only technology; it's philosophy. It's you know, the more and more the technique has to hide behind the wine, and all the technical things are just there to make the wine we want to make. It's not the purpose. It's a tool. They are tools to make the wine and to make the style we want to have.
And how do you describe that style?
Huh. Well, it's I would say complicated in a few words, but the idea is to preserve the identity of Champagne. It means to preserve the identity of the grapes and the soil and the climate. So it means wine with freshness, liveliness, but depth, with the special fact of aging on lees in Champagne.
I note in one of the notes that you mentioned subtlety and distinction, which I thought summed it up rather nicely. So talking about the main range, Bertrand, the antique range, which, as you said, is presented in this beautiful bottle, which is quite unusual for Champagne. What are the main three wines that make this range up?
There are indeed three wines representing mainly the style of Gosset. The main wine that we produce is Grande Reserve, which is not the first one we taste, but it's certainly the face of Gosset. This red, the red label on the antique bottle, which is really the balance in the range. And then we've got two others. One which is the Grand Rosé, and the Grand Rosé is quite an important one at Gosset. Gosset was very early to propose a rosé in Champagne of this certain style that we will describe later, which is quite a, even though the color is not the most important thing, which is quite a pale style, but also in taste, and which is a style very much based on Chardonnay. So when this rosé was released last century, you know, the rosé offer in Champagne was not as strong and as developed as it is today. And Suzanne Gosset, who created this wine, was very, you know, we're talking about being innovative. She was very innovative in proposing this style of rosé. And the third wine, which is much more recent in the range because it was launched just less than 10 years ago, is the Blanc de Blanc. And the Blanc de Blanc is typically also presented in the antique bottle, but you know, very easy to recognize because it is presented in a clear bottle now. And I guess that represents well the style of Blanc de Blanc, so Chardonnay only. And it's a wine that was added, as I said, more recently in the range, but which has become one of the key wines, one of the favorites from us.
Okay, that makes up a very delicious threesome there. So just let's start with the wine that you would like to begin with, the rosé. Bertrand, do you want to just talk a little bit about the style of the rosé, and in particular that it was introduced by Suzanne Gosset? What was that, back in the sort of 1950s, 1960s?
The idea of the rosé from Suzanne was she ended up making a rosé with basically a touch, you know, un soupçon, as we say, of red wine addition in order to soften, you know, the style of the wine. And you know, if you start with the main Brut back then, or Grande Reserve, you have a style which is quite structured anyway, you know, for a Brut non-vintage. With the rosé, you are more on the delicate side. And I guess delicacy is probably, in my opinion, the word that works well with the rosé. And given this style and as the tradition at Gosset, we like to start with the rosé, which is probably our true and typical aperitif wine.
So Odilon, shall we talk a little bit about how the rosé is made up? I believe that it's fairly unusual in the fact that it has quite a large proportion of Chardonnay making up the blend. So can we talk a little bit about the making of the rosé?
Yes, the key word you've said is blend. You know, there is several methods to make a rosé in Champagne. There is the blended one and what we call the rosé de saignée. Rosé de saignée is a tank of red wine that we take the wine before it became red. That's not the method we use at Gosset. We use the blending. It means that we build the cuvée with several grape variety, with an ID. You're right. We had a big proportion of Chardonnay in the rosé. It's a bit tricky, but it's just because we want to have the liveness, the freshness coming from the Chardonnay and coming with this minerality, salinity coming from the Chardonnay. That's why Bertrand told you it's also a rosé for aperitif, because of this salinity, minerality of the wine, and the very specific aromas of coming from the red wine with this red fruit aromas and so on. And you can keep the wine from aperitif to a meal. It's the idea of the rosé. It's a wine you can have on several times and I don't know, and whenever you want. That's the idea. That's the idea of the rosé.
The rosé for all seasons. So my understanding is it's 50% Chardonnay and 50% Pinot Noir, but of that 50% Pinot Noir, it's actually a proportion of still red wine that gives it the beautiful colour. And then with all Gosset wines, it obviously has a long aging on the lees because you have avoided the malolactic fermentation, which maintains the freshness in the wine. So how long has this been on lees in the cellar before we release it?
Well, you're right when you are talking about balance with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but it's not stuck in the stone. Each blend is different because each year is different, and the idea is the consistency of the taste and consistency of the wine itself.
Do you have it there? Do you have a bottle open that you can show to us?
Yeah, this one.
There we are. Beautiful pink label.
On this specific one, we have 55% of Chardonnay. It's not exactly the same for the one for the cuvée which was just before and the one will be after, because we have to adapt in function of the year we have and of the ripeness of the year we have. So that's why blending is important, to have the consistency. The red wine added is quite special because we make a blend of red wine at Gosset coming from 3 villages, which are Ambonnet, Bouzy, and Cumières, to have on the same ID a consistency of red wine. You were talking about avoiding malolactic fermentation. I prefer to say that we keep the natural acid of the grapes, because as you know, the malic acid is in the grapes like the tartaric acid. The lactic is not. So it's to preserve the real roots of the grapes, the real aromas and the real structure of the grapes itself. And you said that the malic acid is more acidic than the lactic. That's right, more fresh. I won't say acidic, I would say more with more freshness, with more delicacy. But we have to keep the wine longer on lees to have the right balance because of this freshness. So you were talking about our winemaking and especially about lees. We are working a lot with lees at Gosset. On all the wines before blending, we keep the wine on lees for a very long time, with sometimes removing the lees in the tanks like we do in Burgundy. Not every year, it depends, once again, it depends on the ripeness of the year. All of these are tools to have the consistency of the taste. So some year you have to do it, some years you don't have to do it because it's ripe enough. So that's the idea. Never have a recipe for vinification. It's, for me, it's the key word for vinification is no recipe. Just the aim of what you want to do. So long time aging on lees on tanks, and then I would say a very long time in bottle. As you know, the Champenois method have a secondary fermentation in the bottle. And at Gosset, we keep the wine in the bottle after the secondary fermentation more than twice that is usually done in Champagne.
So what's the minimum? The minimum is, I think, 15 months.
You're right. You're right. Our minimum is about 30 to 36 months on the lees. And after a long time, also after disgorgement, to have the wine to balance after the disgorgement.
Wow. Okay. And do you have the rosé there to taste? What's it taste like, Odilon?
Of course I have.
What would a tasting be without a glass?
So I've got special glasses, which are more red wine glasses. I don't know if you see it.
Like we can, yes.
I prefer this compared to the flute because all the aromas, all the, well, it depends how you taste the champagne. If you want to taste it in a cocktail or whatever, it doesn't matter what of the glass. If you taste it as a wine, you have to have a wine glass. That's very important to have all the complexity, all the facets of the wine.
This goes back to the idea that you're making wine first that happens to have bubbles.
You know, as I used to say, I'm very proud to be a winemaker and not a bubble maker.
I interrupted your pouring.
Okay, Rosie, if you see, it's not easy, but you see the color. It's quite a pale color, as Bertrand told you, because the color is a consequence of the wine. The idea is not the color. The idea is the wine itself. So we never have a very strong color because we want to have delicacy in a rosé. That's why there is about 8, depending on the year, between 7 and 9% of red wine in the blend, which is quite nothing. Just to have, once again, this red fruit aromas, more easy, I would say, on the nose, and to balance with a real wine on a palate with freshness, depth, and which is, in my opinion, the more important for aperitif is this minerality, salinity you have at the end of the palate, just to refresh the palate before having a meal, before having another glass of anything. That's the key. The key things in wine, in wines, are this minerality, this delicacy on the wine. Bertrand, si tu veux reprendre.
Nice smell. It's important to realize that when we talk about delicacy for wine like this, the wines of Gosset are quite structured, you know, but people often think that either you've got a light wine, either you've got a powerful wine, you know, which is probably often based more on red grapes in Champagne, you know, with some tannins, you know, with aging in barrels. And no, the idea here is very much to keep as much as possible what is the identity of the great terroirs, of the chalky terroir, is this crisp, you know, very even tight at the beginning. That's why we need time. And when you work in preserving the malic acid, you know, you preserve also a dynamic in the wine. You know, so you can be on a wine which is very delicate, but which is very active in mouth as well, which has a firm, a thin but firm structure. It's not a contradiction, and that's probably the goal. You know, not something, you know, overpowering, you know, upfront on the palate, and just strong and just impressive. Just finesse. And that's and for finesse you need I would say you need the nervosity which is provided by the terroir and which is kept and by the type of winemaking that Odilon does, you know, nourishing from the natural lees and preserving the wine from oxidation, and so preserving its identity basically and letting it develop in the long term in the bottle. So I think it's important to understand that it's not about power, but it's not light and thin wines either. It's a different option, which for us is a very natural option, but which is also a strong statement, because you need to, of course, you need to be very. It's a lot of work that the Odilon and his team do with the vats. He was talking about, you know, the lees, the thin lees, the pumping over of the lees, you know, keeping on raw lees, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of tailor-made work about the natural elements of the wine. If you want. It's a physical approach of winemaking.
So we should move on to really the main signature of the house, which I believe to be the Grande Reserve.
Yes.
Which is the bottle that Bertrand has been showing, the one with the beautiful red label. So Bertrand, if you would just give us a little overview of the Grande Reserve and the style that consumers would be finding when they buy their bottle of Gosset Grande Reserve.
Yes, of course, and it's I guess it's the continuity of what I just said. It's, if you want, the idea of Grande Reserve is not to be, I would say, another entry-level, light, fruity, bubbly champagne. The idea of Grande Reserve, it's, I mean, we have a very high idea of what the signature of the house should be. And it should convey all the qualities you can find in the Gosset wine. And Odilon always says that it's probably the most challenging wine to make because, you know, there is, of course, no compromise in making this wine. And you need to find it all. That's what's difficult. It's not like you're taking a certain option, like you can do on a vintage wine. You can do maybe on some other wines like Blanc with just one grape variety. Here, you have a blend of typically Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It's a balance here as well between the two. This time with a small addition of Pinot Meunier. And the idea is very much to have a wine which is very assertive of the Gosset style. So structure, depth, dynamics, freshness. So probably a lot of roundness and texture, and quite, you know, not heavy wine, but certainly intense wine. And that's probably the difference you'll find with most Brut non-vintage champagne, the intensity that you can find with one. So a lot of character, very assertive of the style, very earthy at the same time, but always very easy to taste, you know, never overwhelming. And that's the challenge, if you want, with Grande Reserve. It's not the entry in the range, it's the core of the range, it's the art of the range. And it should deliver all this balance, and it should be delicious at all times. And that's a challenge, because again, it's very assertive of the Gosset style. You know, when you try Grande Reserve, you got the entire Gosset experience. It's not just the entry in the range. You're completely into the range with Grande Reserve. So of course, it's we are very proud of this this wine, which is also before passing the microphone to Odilon, is an example of this, I would say, pedigree is its potential of aging. The potential of aging of Grande Reserve, once you have purchased a bottle of Grande Reserve, if you want to keep it longer in your cellar, according to your taste, you can keep it for 5, 10, 15 years, and it's beautiful wines for aging as well.
So, Odilon, that's quite an introduction to the Grande Reserve. Most people would think of a non-vintage blended champagne as sort of the entry level, but as Bertrand says, this is by no means entry level. This is the heart of the Gosset range. Is this your favorite wine to make? Is this your most difficult child? How do you feel about the Grande Reserve?
Wow. I don't know if I can add anything after Bertrand, because he's talking about the wine better than I. And Bertrand told you that it's the more difficult to do. I think it's right, because it is the identity card and the identity of the house, this Grande Reserve. Once again, it's the deposit of the style. So we need to have in this wine all what we want to have in the range of Gosset. It means that it has to have a family link with all the other cuvées, the rosé, the blanc de blanc, the vintages, or whatever. We need to have this family link. We were talking about depth, delicacy. I said that to have freshness, delicacy, and this wonderful thing in the wine, you need to have foundations. And if you don't have this, you can have delicacy, you have poorness. That's the most difficult to do in the wine, having freshness, delicacy. But to have that, you have to have the foundations, and you don't have to see the foundation. It's like the Eiffel Tower. It's wonderful, but you don't see the foundations. It's the same thing for the wine. You have to have it, but you don't have to feel it. So this is the idea of winemaking here, and especially for the Grande Reserve. It's right that it's the wine you can take from every hour of the day, of the night, or whatever. It's the idea of this, and the idea of the definition of what is the Gosset style. If you want more fruitiness, more I would say roundness, but it's not the right term. You will go through the rosé that we have just before. If you want to have more salinity, more minerality, you'd go through the Blanc de Blanc, but always with this link with all the cuvées, which is the Gosset style.
So the wine itself, as we have discovered, you don't like to give it a recipe as such, but on the whole, it will be a balance between the three main champagne grapes, the Chardonnay, the Pinot Noir, with a touch of Pinot Meunier. And all of these grapes are coming from Premier Cru, Grand Cru vineyards that you have worked with for a long time and that you know very, very well. and that you blend, I think you've described it before, like using a sort of spice rack, and you can take a little from one region and a little from another, in order to get a consistency, a consistent wine over the years that will age gracefully for many years. I have to ask, do you have a glass with you as we're talking?
Yes, of course I have. Just a few words about the grapes we use. I told you the key word is no recipe. It's the same thing. You were talking about Premier Cru, Grand Cru, and other cru. It depends on the year. It depends on the crop. Sometimes you've got Premier Cru that it's better for the blend than Grand Cru, or other crus which taste not better. Better is not the right term, but more interesting for the blend. So that's why we need to be very aware about the grapes and the place they come from. It depends. You were talking about Pinot Noir, about Chardonnay. Let's talk about Pinot Noir, for example. On the very ripe year, we will prefer the black grapes, the Pinot Noir coming from the Montagne de Reims, because it's cooler from other places. So we'll have more freshness, more elegance. On the year where the ripeness is not so big, we will prefer wine coming from more south, from Aube or whatever. So each year we have to adapt with the climate, with the crop, with the wine we want to do. The only guideline is what we want to do. All the grapes, where they come from, the percentage of the grapes are tools to reach the goal we have, which is the same style, the same wine years to years, even if the grapes are totally different years to years. So, as I told you, we are very aware about the grapes and the place they come from. Just to show you, all the tasting at Gosset for the blend or for the dosage are made blind, to have no idea about the place where the grapes come from, to have no preconscious idea of what we are tasting, to be, once again, to be really aware of what we are tasting, to be focused on the wine, not from the place they come from, but just on the wine itself and what it will bring in the blend. You were talking about spices and things like that. We have a very special policy for that, for the Reserve wine. As you know, you said that the Grande Reserve is what we call a non-vintage. Non-vintage means that you have several years in the blend, once again, to have this consistency of the taste. We've got a special policy for the Reserve wine. We don't use a lot, but we use them as spices. So they are not stored by year. I can't tell you we've got a 2016, a 2017 tank of Chardonnay coming from, I don't know, Avis, Ménil, or whatever. But I can tell you we've got several tanks of Chardonnay with very strong attack, with deepness, with length, with freshness, with minerality. And we use this minerality, this freshness, this maturity as spices to make the blend and to put them in the blend, to have, I'd say, like a chef, just to have the right taste we are looking for. Our blends are not based, for the consistency, it's not based on the Reserve wine. It's the Reserve wine are just there to complement what it may miss in this year.
That's quite important, because that's also in the approach that's quite specific to Gosset, to have the what Odilon just described. You know, you will hear about a lot of houses, and it's, you know, it's completely fine, of course, because it's very common in Champagne, that rely for their style, for the famous consistency in style, a lot on reserve wines, on the reserve wines, which is not not so much the case at Gosset. And I think it plays a role in the dynamic of the wines in mouth as well. You know, in the energy on the wines, because obviously reserve wines tend to be kept in vats and are a bit older. And a lot of houses in Champagne go to are searching the complexity from their reserve wines. They keep along in vats to have this complexity, where probably at Gosset we favor the idea of aging in the bottle to reveal the complexity of the wine. So, you know, it's little differences, but I think it's one of the strong, you know, like others, of the strong features of the approach of Gosset wine with non-vintage, which basically means that a non-vintage at Gosset, even though it varies every year, is mainly and by far based on 1 year. Voilà. It's true for the Rosé, it's true for Grande Reserve to some extent, and it's very true as well for the Blanc de Blanc, which is the next wine.
And talking of that next wine, Bertrand, do you want to just talk a little about the Blanc de Blanc, the newest wine to be added to the range?
Newest, it was released actually 9 years ago. So it's true at the scale of Gosset, it's very new. It's interesting that there was no Blanc de Blanc at Gosset before that, because this wine had become such a typical wine from the range. But as I said, now presented in a clear bottle, which I think reflects very well the style, the brightness of the wine. But you know, I will certainly let Odilon explain about this wine, because Odilon brought the Blanc de Blanc to Gosset. That's for the story, if you want, bringing I think what is probably his favorite style in Champagne, Blanc de Blanc. But bringing this new addition to Gosset a few years ago. So I will let Odilon, of course, explain what was the intention behind that.
So we'll pass to Odilon. Odilon, Blanc de Blanc, your introduction, your baby.
Well, interesting, because I was telling you that Gosset was looking forward for more than 4 centuries, and this Blanc de Blanc is show that. As you know, Blanc de Blanc is 100 Chardonnay, and the Chardonnay is quite a new grape in Champagne, because it has been introduced once 150 years ago only. Well, Bertrand told you that I'm very fan with Chardonnays and with Blanc de Blanc, because for me it reveals the real interest of Champagne, with this minerality, salinity, the choky taste. And what is Champagne different is choke and climate. That's why Champagne is different from other countries all over the world. You know, the more, well, it's not only climate, but the more the climate change, the more the grape varieties and so on, the wine change on the last 50 years, I would say, with more ripeness, with more roundness. And to have the real Champagne that I tasted when I was a kid, Chardonnay is very interesting, because more freshness, more once again, more minerality, less ripeness, and that's why it's so interesting for me, and that's why the Blanc de Blanc is so important, because it's even if it's a new grape variety in Champagne, it came back to the roots of Champagne, and it means that we adapt with this new grape variety 1 century and a half ago, to have the consistency of the taste. As I told you all over this interview, is consistency of the taste, and that's a key point. And at Gosset, for example, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, we were mainly Pinot Noir in the cuvée. Now, we are mainly Chardonnay in our blend, just to keep the same style. And that's why Chardonnay is a mark, very interesting in Champagne.
So I would always imagine a Blanc de Blanc Champagne as being quite light, quite ethereal, almost lacy, kind of like dentelle. Is that something that you think you would find in your Blanc de Blanc? Is that your style?
You know, if you've got only dentelle, it's nothing. You need to have something behind to have a real interest of it. So it's the same thing. If you don't have any foundation on the Blanc de Blanc, it's just light and just, what do we call in French, evanescent. It's with no consistency, with no interest. To have the Blanc de Blanc, to have its interest, to have an interesting Blanc de Blanc, you need to have, once again, foundation. That's why we are sourcing Chardonnay from several places in Champagne, not only in the the Côte des Blancs, which is the most popular place for Chardonnay. But we are sourcing Chardonnay in the Montagne de Reims, where the Pinot Noir is in the land of Pinot Noir. We are sourcing also Chardonnay in the Marne Valley, where it's more Pinot Meunier, just to have differences and to have a complexity even in Chardonnay. It's not because it's a Blanc de Blanc on a 100 Chardonnay that it's not blended. It's blended with several villages to have the complexity, to have the my English is not good enough. To build this cuvée, to have.
Sounds fabulous. I know you have a bottle with you, Odilon.
I've got a bottle, and you know they're always sold in this gift box because, as you know, it's a clear bottle, and the light, to preserve from the light problem, from the light disease. That's why it's in this box. And please keep the bottle as long as you can in this box to prevent from the light problems. So Chardonnay, clear bottle, Blanc de Blanc. You know, it's what is important in a Blanc de Blanc for me is to have at the nose this freshness, this lemony, citrusy, honey flavor. Because it's not because it's a Blanc de Blanc, but it has to be on only one thing, which is freshness. You need to have complexity, and that's why, especially on the Blanc de Blanc, I was telling you about the lees and the way of the winemaking, and keeping the wine on lees for the wine to take depth, and that's important in a Chardonnay, not to be just a very fresh wine. It has to be foundation. Not roundness because it's a Blanc de Blanc, but to be round enough to support the freshness, the minerality, and the salinity. That's the important thing for a Chardonnay.
And we've discussed that oysters would be a fantastic match with this.
Do you have the oysters? I've got the wine.
Bring the oysters. Yes, oysters, fantastic with that. I mean, it's a very easy, but I think especially a natural match. But the Blanc de Blanc is very flexible. I mean, foie gras, you know, Christmas is approaching, and foie gras, and for me, when I think, I love foie gras and champagne, and with Blanc de Blanc, you know, you can really cut the angle, cut the fat of the foie gras, and it's and the balance between the two is absolutely fantastic.
I think that's an extremely French recommendation. I'm not sure.
Yes, yes. Sorry. That's it. I was born like this and raised like this. It's of course everybody doesn't like foie gras, but when you do, I think a Blanc de Blanc is a very good because people think sometimes you need a wine which is probably which has more developed characters, maybe like an old vintage, and that's probably also more. You would say British taste to go this way, but I recommend to try Blanc de Blanc, which does Blanc de Blanc again doesn't mean light and young and green wine, not at all. You know, this wine is 5 years old. It, as a Grande Reserve, it could age extremely well, and you know, and for the foie gras, it's fantastic with cheese, and especially goat cheese. I think I'm just mentioning things that as you can see, don't need a lot of preparation, just to. But a great cheese is fantastic, and a Blanc de Blanc with a goat cheese, you know. Yeah. So sorry, I'm not good enough with English cheese, but you take Loire Valley cheese, for instance, with a Blanc de Blanc champagne, that's absolutely delicious, and because you've got this kind of similar sense of minerality to some extent, which works very well. So you don't need, you know, to have maximum, I think, pleasure with the Blanc de Blanc and a food association. You don't need to go for something too complicated. But we all know that a nice fish, of course, to remain very classic, would be always a good option. Think of a Blanc de Blanc, and I'm talking for Gosset, of course. So think of the Grand Blanc de Blanc as a wine that you can really have instead of your favorite white Loire or white Burgundy or white wine in general. Again, forget about the bubbles. Use maybe this for aperitif, but use maybe this, so your Burgundy glass, for the rest of the meal. Use a carafe if you want the wine to breathe a bit and not be so as tight as it can be in the first place, and according to your taste. You can really play around Blanc de Blanc. So it's a very it's also a very flexible wine in this sense. And with the carafe on top of that, you may lose just, you know, a touch of gas that will bring the wine back in this category of I'm saying white Burgundy because we all know it's a great reference in terms of white wine, but it's really. The Blanc de Blanc is a bit like this. I mean, it plays the same role for me.
I think what I'm taking from what we've talked about this morning, that the Gosset wines have this capacity to age, this elegant power, and a gastronomic character to them, where you have to look at the wines underneath the bubbles. As they have the true character and the true power of the house. So I hope that the people who've been watching this and us talk along have enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add?
Thank you.
Then I think we've covered a lot in great detail. So I'm going to thank you very much both for your time, and let's hope that the people watching can enjoy the Gosset in their own homes, and hopefully enjoy a very festive period coming up. So thanks so much, guys. That was great fun. Cheers.